Let me start with Steve Roman, a very old friend of mine. I've known Steve for a long time. Steve, interesting story if you listen to him. His family many, many years ago changed their name to Roman. They were Romansky. They were Jewish. They were a Jewish family that immigrated here. Steve, though, has an illustrious career. One of my favorite stories with Steve, he's a big member of the business community for a long time. When I was mayor, he and I had to work together. One of the issues that we had to work together on was the Martin Luther King Day. The Martin Luther King Day, which gave us really a sore bruise. Steve was really one of the #1 people responsible for putting that together. He's a force all in himself. Steve, thanks for being here with us. And Professor Thompson will tell you he's not from Australia. I know that because he tells me that almost every week on our podcast. He's from New Zealand, Australia, but in any event, he tells me that almost every week. This is a bright young guy who not only is a professor at ASU, but he has made a study of authoritarian governments. He is a wealth of knowledge on that topic. He's somebody that's worthwhile to listen to. I think he has an incredible career in front of him, not just in being a professor, but in this type of a spotlight as well. So, Professor, if you'd like to do the introduction.
Right, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor and joy for me to be here today. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Emmanuel Navon, who is really a world expert on Israeli history, especially Israeli foreign policy and diplomatic history, and on the history of anti-Semitism. He is the executive director of the European Leadership Network Israel, which is an NGO or an organization that tries to foster ties between Europe and Israel, especially based on their shared strategic interests, but also democratic values. He was born in France and studied public administration at the very prestigious Sciences Po University in Paris before he did a PhD in international relations at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has been lecturing international relations at Tel Aviv University since 2002, so for over 20 years, and he's also lectured at other places, including for the Israeli Armed Forces. He's been widely published both in scholarly and popular outlets. He's published 4 books, which is twice as many as I've published, so very impressive. And his most recent book is called The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel. It was published in 2020, and as a sort of a reflection of the reach of his work, it's already been translated into Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese, French, and Italian, which is an incredibly impressive record for a book that's only been just released. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Navon, and we're looking forward to your comments. So I've been told that I should ask the first question, and so I'll just get straight to that. And I'm going to ask you, Dr. Navon, a question about your book, which is called The Star and the Scepter. And in your book, you use these two sort of images of the star, which is Israel's sense of its historic mission, and the scepter, which is the way that Israel adapts to real-world conditions, or how it articulates its own self-interest or even utilizes military force or power. Maybe you could give our guests here today a sense of how you think that tension between these two goals, so the star, the historical mission, and the scepter, the adaptation to real-world events, how they've shaped Israeli diplomacy historically, but also how they're shaping Israel's response to these attacks on October the 7th.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to take part in this conference. Good morning to you. Good evening here from Jerusalem. As you mentioned, the title of my book is The Star and the Scepter. The subtitle is A Diplomatic History of Israel. And it's a book that covers basically 3,000 years, of diplomatic history. And the title is inspired from the book of Numbers, in which it says that a star will emerge from Jacob and a scepter from Israel. And the question is, what is the meaning of the star and of the scepter when we know that basically Jacob and Israel are the same person? I claim basically that there is a tension in Jewish history between the two poles, between national identity or religious identity and power. The scepter is a symbol of political power, and the star is the symbol of Israel's mission in the world. Paul Johnson mentioned before that both Israel and America are a cause And what it distinguishes Israel is that it's a nation based on an idea, based on a historical mission. But we've seen through that our long history that spans over more than 3,000 years, that during most of that period, the Jews were without a nation, without a country, without a state, without a sword, without a scepter, in fact. And that when this happened, the Jewish people was always threatened of extinction. But on the other hand, sovereignty and political power are not an end in themselves. They must serve a higher cause, which is symbolized by the star, by the identity and the purpose of Israel. And we see it today. I mean, today the Jews finally rebuild their power for a cause. And we see our enemies around the world, including on US campuses, that want to deny the Jews their ability to defend themselves. We hear those words, those claims on US campuses today that Zionism is the worst enemy of Judaism, which is of course completely absurd because the two are connected. The Jews became a nation and brought the message to the world when they became sovereign in the land of Israel. And those who want the end of Israel basically are saying that they have nothing against the Jews as long as they cannot defend themselves and as long as they're vulnerable. And this is why it is a common struggle today between Israel and the United States. The same way that Israel is being attacked, is being assaulted around the world, including on US campuses, so are America and its core values. And this is why it is a common struggle, and this is why we have to win this struggle together.
So I'll take the second question, Dr. Navon. What I find to be interesting, the star and the scepter idea, I really want to dig into it because I think it's helpful for people to understand that oftentimes in history, your book was very ambitious. It went all the way back to antiquity. By the way, a very enjoyable book. I especially love the historical portion. But there have been societies, there have been Israeli communities that have tried either one without the other. Groups that have attempted to put together just the scepter portion, just to have a government that was a Jewish government, and then others that have tried to fulfill just the historical mission without the power. Namely, we saw that from intellectuals in Germany during the 1920s and 30s. Can you talk about that concept and what we actually saw in history when the two weren't combined?
So, as you mentioned, it is true that when towards the mid and late 19th century, many Jews, especially in Europe, started trying to rebuild Jewish sovereignty in the historical land of Israel, then many ideological and intellectual opponents, especially among German Jews. Typically, the Jewish German philosopher Hermann Cohen, who was an expert on Immanuel Kant, believed that the Jews should only have the star, should only have the spiritual message, and that power, political power, was incompatible with Jewish values, which is why he was a strong opponent of Zionism. This was also the case of another Jewish German intellectual, Franz Rosenzweig, who also thought that the Jews had a spiritual mission that could not be kind of polluted, so to speak, by political power, and therefore they opposed Zionism, they opposed political power. But of course, history proved them wrong. It is in their country, in Germany, that the German state under the Nazis perpetrated a Holocaust against the Jews, which went to confirm that the Jews do need political power, do need a physical basis in their land in order to carry out their spiritual mission. The two are connected. Of course, there's another tendency. Many among the early Zionists, some of them at least, sought to rebuild political power, but disconnected from Jewish history. They were called the Canaanites at the time. They just were interested in rebuilding sovereignty and power, but disconnected from Jewish history. I think both were wrong. Those who think that Israel can rely only on spirituality, and those who think it can rely only on political power, it needs both. It needs a balance between the two, as has been proven by our 3,000-year-old history.
Steve?
Doctor, how does that translate within the community of the power structure within Israel itself? You've got a liberal side, you have an extremely conservative side, you have politics within that entire community. How does the structure within the power of Israel translate to what's happening and how they're going to resolve what's taking place right now?
So like any free society, like any democracy, Israel has a political debate between people who are more conservative, those who are more liberal. I would say, in a sense, we have a typical right and left divide, just as in other democracies. But I think also that what we've seen in recent years, and we've seen it before, of course, the war with Hamas, and you've all followed in the news the very deep political divide in Israel surrounding what was discussed at the time, the judicial reform or the reform of our judicial system. It is true also that because Israel is both a very old civilization and a country that reached its independence only 75 years ago, that there are many issues that have never been settled really in our society, in our political system. We never really had the equivalent of the Federalist in America with constitutional issues being discussed in depth. Our country was formed and became independent in the middle of a war, and many of our political and judicial institutions were formed democratically, but without a formal constitution. And this is also why we still have a debate about fundamental questions on the separation of power, on the separation between state and religion. I think that after 75 years of independence, it is about time that we have an in-depth conversation and discussion on those issues instead of the very divisive struggle that we had before October 7. And I think that one of the lessons of October 7 is that we must, as a society, remain united on basic ideas and concepts, even when we disagree on how to organize our constitutional system. And I hope and believe that after the war, we shall have not only new elections and a new government, but also a national convention about finally adopting a constitution that will settle the issues that were so violently divisive during the year that preceded the war.
Great. Dr. Navon, could you give us your assessment of Israeli policy towards Gaza and Hamas since the October 7th attacks? And maybe, given that we're here in Arizona, some words on diplomacy between Israel and the United States and Israel and Europe, and perhaps even your thoughts on the prospects for post-war governance in Gaza.
So first of all, we need to understand that the reason why October 7 happened is not because of some frustration from the Palestinians over the lack of a political arrangement with Israel. It is the outcome of an ideology of radical Islam, which wants to impose itself to the rest of the world, which considers the very existence of Israel as an abomination that must be erased. Just listen of what's happening today on US campuses. Burn Tel Aviv to the ground, from the river to the sea. It's an ideology that rejects Israel's very existence. And therefore, when we deal with Hamas, anybody who thinks that we can diffuse Hamas's violence and hatred by reaching a political arrangement has no idea of what he's talking about. Just read Hamas's charter. It is an anti-Semitic document that blames the Jews of the world's ills, including the communist revolution in Russia in 1907, the two world wars, and that calls for the elimination not only of Israel, but all Jews around the world. By the way, a Qatari official last week just said that he hopes that all the Jews will settle in Israel so that the Arab world can eliminate them with one single nuclear bomb. So this is the ideology that we're dealing with. We have to understand that, and therefore we must completely defeat Hamas. We must completely defeat Hamas, and we will. You know, when Winston Churchill addressed the US Congress after Pearl Harbor, he asked about Nazi Germany and Japan the following question: who do you think we are? Don't they realize that we shall continue to persevere until they and the world, until they're taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? This is exactly what Israel has to do with Hamas. They must be taught a lesson. They are being taught a lesson, and they will be taught a lesson which they and the world, including the supporters on US campuses, will never forget. And this struggle has to be fought together as a united world between the United States, Israel, and our allies also in Europe. This is a struggle not only against radical Islam, it is also a struggle about values. And you'll notice who supports Hamas. It is the same countries, they are the same countries that try to undermine the US-led order, countries such as China, Russia, autocracies that support Hamas and Iran. This is the evil axis that we have to deal with. This war must be won, and it will be won.
That covenant, if you read it, you can look it up online. It was done by Hamas as kind of their organizing charter. One of the things I found interesting, and it was in Article 17 and 18, it not only talks about the eradication of all Jews, it says that they also have to eradicate Rotary Club members and Lions Club members, which don't ask me what the Lions Club did, but nonetheless, it's a document that kind of heeds back to this Elders of Zion type of thing, the ancient conspiracy. So I'm going to do some questions with the panel, just in case, until we get Emmanuel back here if we do. One of the interesting things that I saw was in the book, what I liked, was this concept of the star. Here's what I saw in the star. Emmanuel made note that this version of the star was really about the historical mission of Israel. And I really wanted to ask him that question. Maybe we can ask Rabbi Alush later. But the idea is, what is that historical mission? What is the cause? You know, I spoke about the cause a few moments ago. To me, the cause that we're engaged in really surrounds this whole concept of an individualistic society. We have with China, Russia, as well as with Iran, these societies who kind of put the individual on the back burner. They don't believe in civil rights, human rights, equal rights. They're willing to commit incredible atrocities to their own people. I mean, if you go to Iran today, it's the Baha'i that they're after, or the Sufis that they're after, or the Sunnis that don't fall into the sect that is the governing organization. The point is that part of this star is this idea that we can aspire to something better. And I think the connection between us and Israel, as well as, for that matter, other Western liberal democratic countries, is this cause that we're all engaged in. Henry, you spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, this part of the book really resonated with me as well, the idea that Israel stands for a certain set of liberal values, and especially resonated with me because a lot of my work has been on Germany. I lived in Germany for a long time. I'm obviously from New Zealand, as you mentioned, but I lived in Germany for a long time. A lot of my published work on authoritarian regimes has actually been about Germany. And the tragedy, or one of the tragedies of Jewish history in Germany is this tension that Dr. Navon highlights between this mission, which involves individual liberty, and political power or pragmatism, because a lot of Jews in Germany really identified as Germans, especially after World War I. Many of them even fought in World War I. Their individual identities were tied up with the German nation in some cases. And it was assumed that they could continue to practice their religion in that country as individuals. But tragically, that turned out to not be true. And I think this is something that Dr. Navon was talking about, that without political power, without some sort of a state, that it tragically turned out that the Jewish people in Central Europe could not practice their religious freedoms. They couldn't have these individual liberties in a meaningful way without having some sort of political power to protect them in essence. And so that part of his book really resonated with me as well. And it is definitely tragic that we find ourselves now 100 years later in the same situation, or a similar situation where these liberal values and democratic institutions are under threat, not only in Israel but in other parts of the world as well, that we have rising great powers that have very little interest in liberal democracy or liberal institutions and human rights, and in some places like Vladimir Putin, for example, speaks openly about illiberal democracy, rejecting liberalism and democracy, and it's definitely concerning and brings the mind back to these tragic periods of the interwar period and the Holocaust and all these events.
So let me dig into that, and then Steve, I'll come back to you. Here's what I want to dig into. you're on a university, and certainly we have one of the best FIRE ratings, meaning free speech ratings with ASU. But this concept really begs the question, is there such a thing as a universal value? Are all values relative to one another, right? So Edward Said wrote this book. He was a Palestinian. He wrote this book called Orientalism. And in the book, he talked about this post-colonial era, right, which was based upon a book that came before him, or a philosopher that came before him, Foucault, who had talked about there really are no universal values. It's just a way in which one person kind of discriminates against another. And the post-colonialism that was done by Edward Said said, you know, these ideas such as all people are created equal is really just done so that we can oppress people from Eastern countries. And of course, he put Palestine in those Eastern countries as well as a number of others. He said their values are as good as ours. Well, I want to contest that. Is killing your daughter an honor killing because she was raped a value that's equal to ours? Is the idea that if you're gay, that you could serve 10 years in jail equal to ours? Is the idea that you can discriminate against people wholeheartedly with without regard to their civil rights or equal rights? Are those values actually equal? I tend to think, and I think we used to teach civics in a way in which said, no, they're not equal. There's a big difference. But it seems to me like we've had this drift towards saying, no, let's be diplomatic, and let's just pretend that they are all equal. Can you give me your thoughts on what's going on civics education? I know that I probably threw you for a twist here, but we did lose our speaker. Right. So so I'd love to hear your thought on that.
I thought you were going to ask about the protests, so this is we can talk about that next, maybe. Okay, so my thoughts on this. I'm a political scientist. I'm mostly an empirical political scientist. I run all statistical models. I write case studies. I'm not a political philosopher, but I have done a lot of research on authoritarian regimes and on communist regimes. And for me, a lot of this thinking echoes Marx. So everyone here knows who Karl Marx was. He was actually ethnically Jewish, although not practicing Jew. But his theory basically articulates that capitalist society, in which we all live because we have the institution of private property, involves exploitation of the poor by the rich. And that's the basic class structure in society. It structures everything, right? So there can be religious differences, there can be cultural differences, but they're all kind of superficial to the foundation of society, which is the exploitation of the poor by the rich. So this is Marxist thinking, and we all know where that led. It was kind of went out of fashion. Actually, Marx was pretty irrelevant until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and then he received a new lease on life when a regime was basically founded in his name by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia. And so when you mention Foucault and Said and all these people who I haven't really read in a lot of detail, I must admit, I'm not a political philosopher, but I've read enough to say there are strong echoes of Marx. I would almost call these theories, whether it's post-colonial theory in the case of Said or postmodern theory in the case of Foucault, I would call them neo-Marxist theories. The structure of society is always set. It's always the exploitation or the oppression of one group by another, and that structure never changes. And so to me, these are kind of neo-Marxist theories, and I think a lot of these people really identified with Marx as well, trying to impose a lens of exploitation of one group by another onto society in ways that simply don't hold up, right? We know that the societies are not structured only by this single cleavage of exploitation of one group by another, etc. But it does lead to a certain set of prescriptions, revolutionary prescriptions, for example, in the case of the Bolsheviks, that a capitalist society has to be overthrown because it can never be reformed, because it will always involve the exploitation of the poor by the rich. And it can lead to radicalism in many different forms, this sort of neo-Marxist, postmodern or post-colonial theory as we see it today. Now, why these theories remain en vogue and perhaps increasing in salience and becoming more fashionable at the university campuses, I personally can't understand, because if you take basic social science class in microeconomics or in political science, these theories will be debunked within a very short period of time. The sort of groups that are posited to be the exploiters and the exploited simply don't exist. There are collective action problems. People don't simply cohere into groups like classes or races or religious groups that exploit others in these simplistic ways that Marxists and postmodernists think that they do. Nonetheless, these sorts of theories have continued to be on vogue and really are increasing in salience at universities at the moment, and they are taught in wide swathes of the humanities and social sciences to the extent that there seems to be almost a universal canon that leads from Marx via Foucault to more modern post-colonial and critical theorists that's taught across large parts of the social sciences, but also the humanities. So we can, at a modern university, you might also analyze literature through the same Marxist or post-colonial lens as you would politics. So these theories are really quite trendy at the moment. They might go back out of fashion in the future, I don't know, but they are trendy on campuses, and they lead to a lot of silly ideas and bad thinking, I would say, and to a lot of angst and anxiety among students who are taught that the world is this very dark place based on exploitation and conflict, when I just don't really believe that's true. And our liberal democracies are founded on a completely different set of principles, based on individual rights and liberties, not group or class-based rights and liberties. And those institutions have proven to be far more successful than any of the alternatives. For example, the institutions in the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe or even in China that are based on these class-based or group-based divides and therefore tend towards enabling authoritarianism have been spectacularly unsuccessful. Our institutions have been spectacularly successful. And so I think we do need to come back to the actual question about civics. I think we do need to do a better job of pointing that out to students and young people, that these theories based on group divisions and group divides and exploitation, A, they don't really explain reality. They have no basis in good social science or in reality. And B, they don't match up to the facts. That all of the regimes that have been instituted in those theories' name have failed spectacularly, apart from perhaps the Chinese regime, although I guess we can all just wait and see what happens with that. I'm not a big optimist on the Chinese Communist Party. And I think more students need to be taught that lesson, and they might feel a little better about the institutions they live in Western democracies, and less prone to violent demonstrations on campus. Maybe peaceful demonstrations instead.
Yeah, I'm interested in the connection between how this is beginning to permeate the educational system and what we're seeing happen with students. It seems to me that those Marxist ideas that have come through post-colonialism and postmodernism have resulted in this concept that would be attractive to certain populations of the oppressed versus the oppressor. If you see yourself as a victim, which isn't hard to do, especially if you're a college student, right? You left your parents' home, maybe you felt like you were a victim then, and then you get to college and you think you're going to be free, and all of a sudden you realize you actually have to pass your classes to be able to graduate. You can feel a little oppressed in that process, but it's a mindset, it's a view. And so when you're given a philosophy, even though there's nothing historically that says that it works, in fact, all of history tells us it doesn't work. It's a massive failure at colossal level with tens of millions of people being murdered and killed in it. It still can become attractive with the right professor saying that it works. And to me, there seems to be an objective that those professors are often getting to. It's not lost on me, Edward Said, who created post-colonialism, was a Palestinian, right? He had a political agenda in mind that he was trying to promote. And I think our challenge is that when our students see, we have a sign that we're going to put up later that says homosexuals for Palestine, right? Now, I'm a big supporter of human rights, equal rights, and civil rights. I guarantee you they're not. They don't. To me, that brings us to this question that I was hoping to ask, but maybe we can talk about it, which is, how do you even think about creating a solution for Gaza? How can you even think about doing that when you create a society, you put a group of people in charge, and there are no civil rights, there are no equal rights, there's no human rights, property rights don't exist, the people who are in charge of the government have stolen $11 billion from, they're worth $11 billion living in Qatar, and of course they have an agenda to say, hey, it's those guys over there. Those are the guys that are really oppressing you. Because that oppression mindset, what it really does to you in the end of the day is that it takes away your agency to believe, hey, I have the ability to help determine my own destiny. But I don't know as long as you leave Hamas in charge, I don't know how you ever change the outcome. Steve, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm here more for questions like everybody here than I am to provide any kind of answers. And one of the questions that I don't understand is, based on what you were saying, this is a cause-related country, the United States, Israel. There also is an extreme double standard in what's going on right now in terms of results. Right now, what is taking place in the war with Hamas, the double standard in terms of how Israel is prosecuting that war, and if you take a look at the very small number of people that have been harmed in relation to other wars that have taken place. If you take a look at what happened with us and the atom bomb and the people that were injured for us to prosecute that war, if you take a look at China and what they've done to the Uyghurs, if you take a look at a number of other countries, what Iran has done around, why is the double standard on how Israel is prosecuting that war, and what is the reason for that double standard compared to other countries and how they have prosecuted their war? And is the reason because Israel is a cause that many people don't like because of the anti-Semitism that's going on, or are there other reasons behind it?
I think, if I should respond, let me give you my view. My view is that the double standard comes from many different sources. I think that there's probably a strand of anti-Semitism that runs through this as well, but I also think that this neo-Marxist theory that I was describing before plays a major role, because people have been taught, and when I say people, I mean university professors and university students have been taught to impose a pretty simplistic lens on society where there is an oppressor who is bad and an oppressing group, an oppressed group that is good. And they have simply attached that lens to the Israel-Palestine conflict and said, Israel, oppressor, bad, Palestine, oppressed, good. And that is, I think, at the basis of this overly simplistic analysis that leads to almost a setting aside of any comparison, really. Because if you believe that the world is structured at its most basic level between the oppressed, whether it's the ruling bourgeoisie, to take the most simplistic Marxist case, or settler colonialists, to take the postmodern, post-colonial theory version, and those who are being oppressed by those groups, then that is the major cleavage and the predominant cleavage in global society, and there is no comparison. That is the worst thing that it can happen and is happening, and they believe they see it right in front of their eyes, and that's why there is this apparent overreaction or double standard. That's my take.
Yeah, I'd give you two or three items that I think are important in terms of why that double standard exists. The first one, to be fair, everybody thinks they have a right to an opinion on Israel. Everybody, right? I mean, the diaspora Jews that are here feel like they have a right to have an opinion on it. The Christians who are here feel like they have a right to. The Muslim population feels like they have a right to. Israel is such a special place that everyone in the world has concentrated on. And that puts an inordinate pressure on them that doesn't exist in many other countries. I mean, go to their neighbor. Saudi Arabia, we give more weapons to Saudi Arabia than we give to Israel. A lot more. They killed 375,000 Houthis because they're radical jihadists. Nobody said anything. Nobody paid attention, right? There's definitely a double standard. In fact, you could argue that the amount of deaths that have happened in Israel proportionally aren't as bad as what we had with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Not even close, right? So the double standard exists. Now, I do think that there's a strain of anti-Semitism running underneath it. I have no doubt the people who've tried to interfere in keeping you from being here today, they were anti-Semitic groups. There's no doubt about it, all right? There's no doubt about it. Those anti-Semitic groups can help feed those protests. That doesn't mean every student who's there is anti-Semitic. That's not fair. I think they are being influenced by this oppressed versus oppressor, and they're not thinking about it. If you have a victim mentality, you are going to tend to be on the other side if you start with that perspective. But then there's the third part, politics. Look, we have two guys running for president that are competing for 30,000 votes in Michigan. Whoever gets that 30,000 votes is probably going to be president, and the 30,000 are Muslim. All right, and they're both competing for it. That's going on. You can't avoid that. And that's not to say anything else. I'm not trying to blame them for it. Here's what I'm saying. When they then speak to the public, it confuses them about who are we? What is this cause about? Does it matter? Do you think we're a cause for good? Because if you come to the conclusion of, we're not, we're just a different set of values than them, well, I don't know why we're there. But if you believe that the values that this country was founded on are important, and that they matter, and if you can see that part of how we became the greatest superpower in the history of the planet was because those values made us rich. And everybody who's adopted those values, it made rich. No one at any point in time in history has done more to promote human progress, I'd say than us, but I'm going to say than our values. As it turns out, there are some values that are better than others. As it turns out, there are some universal values. And that's the cause. That's what we're fighting about. And if you don't believe that, if you think death to America is the right answer, you're going to come to a different conclusion. And if you're competing for the people who have up the signs that say death to America, the rest of us are going to be confused when we're watching your leadership.
And luckily, these values that have been spectacularly successful, whether they've been implemented in South Korea or in North America or in the Antipodes where I'm from, they also don't involve horrendous crimes against human rights, famine, any number of other outcomes that many people over history have said that dictatorships might stomp on human liberties, on individual liberties and human rights, but at least they get things done. Oh, they've built a great new airport in Beijing, or Hitler built the autobahns, or whatever. Actually, it turns out not only do they trample on individual liberties, they also generate worse economic outcomes, and the very worst economic outcomes, like genocide and famine, things that just do not happen in democracies. So I think we can all count ourselves very lucky that not only do these values and institutions tend to generate good material outcomes, they also are good for human rights and for human flourishing in any number of ways, and we don't have to make that compromise in ways that regimes like Russia and China and Iran would like to think that we do.
Yeah, and I think with Israel, what ends up being missed a lot of times, we see this conflict. So we hear things from college students like it's an apartheid nation, that they're colonizers, right? And the colonizer kind of ties to the Edward Said argument, but the apartheid issue. Okay, well, what does apartheid mean? Apartheid means that you're a state that implements policies based upon race. Well, there's a little problem to that. The problem is there are 2 million Arabs, 2 million Muslims that live inside of Israel, not the people in the West Bank, not the people who are in Gaza, but they have all the same rights as Jewish people have, right? Why? Yeah, they're representative in the Knesset. They actually have a party. They have all the same rights. Trust me, that doesn't happen on the other side.
Oh, it's more so in the other countries. There's more apartheid in every of the surrounding countries of Israel than Israel itself. And yet that gets back to the double standard that we're talking about. And the values lead to wealth. And so the question is it really an issue of the fact that Israel is a wealthier country, the United States is a wealthier country, and there's a bit of jealousy related to that from other countries, or is it the issue of race? Is it the issue of religion? In some ways, I come down to it's more of the wealth factor and the economy than it is anything else. And those that are deprived of a better economy, they're the ones that are dealing with, that are more jealous of what's going on and why they have stronger opinions.
Yeah, and I'll end with this because we've got to get to our next speaker, hopefully. Rabbi Alush and I had this conversation on our podcast. It was a great conversation, but we talked about why does it exist? Why does that anti-Semitism exist? What is anti-Semitism? And I think you're right. I think that envy plays a huge role in it. But what's interesting is if you look all the way back in the Bible, take a look at Jacob and Esau, right? Jacob did some terrible things to his brother. He and his mother deceived Esau, They deceived their father, right? And he had this deal where he had to struggle with God. But the interesting part about it was he then left and went out and worked for somebody else for 7 years to get the wife that he wanted. He tricked him. He then had to go work another 7 years. It's this constant story about struggle. It's this constant story about what the rabbi said early on, which is, no, don't be a victim. Rabbi Alush said to me, look, we went through the Holocaust, but here's what we're not. We're not victims. To me, that is the most powerful message that the star represents. If you are a victim, you're going to go nowhere. You're going to give up your agency to someone else. And oftentimes, they're bad guys trying to take it from you. Israel represents the other side. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll take
and peril. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.